I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at fades. Now specifically we're going to start by looking at how we crossfade between two different pieces of audio. But we're going to go on to look at other ways in which fades can be used within productions because they are absolutely central to the way that we can make audio flow smoothly through our tracks. Let's just have a listen to the track we're going to be working on, and then we're going to create some audio from some things that are currently MIDI. Okay, so what we've got is a very pad heavy mix, and the reason why it's pad heavy is because I've got two separate pads within this track, and actually what I want to do is to create an audio file which is a sort of combination of both of them rather than both separate sounds playing all the way through. So the first thing I'm going to do is to turn both of these different pad parts into audio. I'm going to select pad number one, I'm going to control click, and I'm going to select bounce in place. Now, as ever, if bounce in place doesn't exist within the 5 most recent things you've done within this editor, what you can do is to come down here to bounce and join, and you'll find bounce in place there instead. So I'm going to just select this option, and all I want to do is to simply just bounce this down as a pad. So I'm just going to do that, and it doesn't matter that it was across 2 separate regions. It's just going to create one nice long region for me. I'm going to do the same thing here with pad number 2. Now bounce in place is in my most recent items, and all I'm going to do is to make sure that this one is called pad 2 rather than pad 1. And what I can then do is to take the original MIDI, I'm going to put these two sounds together, I'm going to mute them both. We're going to be focusing on the audio rather than the MIDI regions that created it. Okay, so you can see that I've got these 2 separate pads. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is to chop these pads up. So in other words, what I want to do is to have pad 1 start and then pad 2 take over, and then we're going to have pad 1 again and then pad 2. And what I want to do to start with is to seamlessly kind of morph every single bar between these 2 parts. Now this is where Logic's ability, using the scissors tool, just press T to open up the toolbar, and what that's going to do is to allow us access to the scissor tool, and this allows me to also access a really useful function, which is the notion of multiple divide. Now if I select, let's say, the beginning of bar 3 and I let go, I'm going to get one edit right at the beginning of bar 3 because that's where I've chopped up these 2 audio files, and because they're both selected, both of them will cut at that point. But if I hold down Option at the same time as clicking at the beginning of bar 3, you can see that in the tag underneath the scissors it says divide multiple. And what that basically means is that when I let go, I'm going to end up with multiple chops all the way through the audio files at the distance from the start of the region that I selected. So in other words, this audio file starts at bar 2, I chopped at bar 3, which means we're chopping up in bars. Okay, so to start looking at how I might then go through and select the bits that I want. Well, I said that I wanted to start with pad 1 but not have pad 2, and then I want to move to pad 2 and not have pad 1. So what I'm going to do is to go through and just create this checkerboard effect all the way through this audio. We can get rid of the bars at the end, we don't need them. And then what I'm going to do is to select the pad 2s. In fact, let's just make these a different color so we can easily see which of the pads we're looking at. We'll make the first one, I don't know, what color should we choose? Let's go with this color. Or this color, that's better. We're going to go with this. So we've got one set of pads here, and then we've got these other ones underneath. Now, in order to be able to crossfade, literally fade out one file as the next one fades in, what I need to do is to make sure that they're on the same track. I can't crossfade between 2 different tracks. So having moved those regions up, what we now have is what we refer to as non-contiguous audio. Posh way of saying we've got audio files that weren't recorded so that they continued all the way through. And as a result, what we've got are these edges between the different audio files. And if I was to solo this, I suspect that at the point where one pad takes over from another, we're going to hear a click. Sure enough, you can hear that really clearly as pad 2 goes back to pad 1 at the end of bar 3. Click, really nasty click. Okay, I don't want that. So what I want to do is to use a crossfade as a means to smooth out the relationship between the end of pad 1 and the beginning of pad 2 and vice versa as each one takes over. Okay, so where are Logic's fades? Well, actually, they're available in a couple of different places. So if I wanted to be able to apply a crossfade across each of these pads across multiple files, the best thing for me to do is to select all of them, make sure they're all highlighted, and then come over here. Now you can see that each file can have a fade in or a fade out. So if what I wanted to do was to have each file fade in for a period of time and then fade out, and then the next one fade in and fade out, I could do that very straightforwardly. I could decide how long I want each fade in to be. Let's make it clear by saying, okay, let's have half a second, 500 milliseconds. And let's do the same thing by fading out over the same period of time. Well, okay, that's going to get rid of the clicks, no doubt, but it's not going to produce a particularly smooth result because the first pad's going to wash in and then go, and then the second one's going to do the same. Okay, so we've certainly dealt with the clicks, but as I said, we don't get the smoothness that we want. So what I'm going to do is to throw away these values simply by double clicking again and selecting 0, and we're back to where we started. So instead of having a fade out, what I want to do is to swap my fades for a crossfade instead. Now actually there are 3 different types of crossfade within Logic, and we're going to look at all of them. So the first thing I'm going to do is to select crossfade, and again I'm going to use 500 milliseconds as my value. And what I can now see is I get these X shapes across the pads. And what that basically means is, as one file fades out, the next one starts. So if I follow the line of the fade out on the purple region, what this basically means is the volume is going to drop to the sort of halfway point, and then a bit of this purple region is going to continue to play after the edit line between the 2 individual regions to bring its volume down to 0. And at the same time, this sort of golden region is going to start a little bit early, and it's going to have reached half volume by the time it then takes over, and it's going to continue to rise in volume. So this should be smoother than the fade-ins and fade-outs that we had before. And it is smoother, but you can hear that it's not completely linear either. Now, if we have a look at the waveforms for pad 1 and pad 2, we can see that pad 1 is a sort of, even though it's a less fizzy sound, it's a stronger sound. That signal is louder. I can see the height of the waveform is bigger on average here than it is for pad 2. It's a quieter sound, even though it's kind of fizzier. So what we can hear is that the transition from pad 1 to pad 2 kind of sounds okay. And then as pad 2 ends and pad 1 comes back in, it doesn't feel nearly as smooth as it might. Have another listen. There's a very obvious gap at the end of bar 3. Now this is interesting because what it tells us is that crossfades themselves aren't always all that useful, because what they don't do is to in any way balance the volume between pieces of audio. I nearly said beasts of audio. Beasts of audio sounds like a band. Should we form a band called Beasts of Audio? We should do that. Okay, sorry, Will's here, obviously. Hi, Will. So what we've got here is this idea that the crossfade isn't really managing volume when the volume between beasts of audio files aren't evenly matched. So instead what I want to do is to swap a regular crossfade for a different type of crossfade whose purpose is to try in some way to manage that volume balance a little better. And for this, what we're going to do is to swap out for what's called an equal power crossfade. Now, as you would expect from its name, an equal power crossfade is all about trying to evenly distribute the power or the strength of an audio file as one takes over from another. And you can see that the shape is different now. Rather than these kind of linear drops in volume where we get a perfect X, what we've got now is this slightly curved file where the volume of the purple region here is going to carry on playing at a louder volume than it was before falling away a little bit more sharply. And the second pad is going to start with a little bit more volume boost, sort of before it takes over and becomes the primary audio source. And by the time that happens, it's a little bit louder than it was with the crossfade. Again, just to show you the difference, literally just visually, this is the crossfade. And here is the equal power crossfade, and you can see that the volumes are different. Now, the other thing that I can do to make this even smoother is to get away from the idea of a half-second crossfade. I don't need necessarily to be using that length of crossfade. So the second thing that I can experiment with is, okay, well, what happens if I take this down to a quarter of that length? Okay, so that's a much more extreme change in lane, or change in gear, if you like, from one bar to the next, but it's, you know, it's going to produce a different effect for us. So what we've effectively got is our two different types of fades so far, our regular crossfade and then our equal power crossfade. So that shows us the difference between regular crossfades and equal power crossfades. And before we move on to look at the third type of crossfade, there's another parameter that we need to look at as well. So far what we've done is we have selected our choice of crossfade, and then what we've done is effectively rely on those crossfades to meet perfectly at the join between these two different bits of audio. I can see that the middle point is exactly in the middle of these two regions. But again, one way that I could potentially manage the relationship of one audio file becoming another would be to add a choice of curve. So at the moment, you can see that I've selected my equal power crossfade. And at the moment, there is no curve. But let's have a look for a second. If I was decided that I was going to add a curve of 10, what this is going to do is to bias the crossfade more in favour of the outgoing audio file. In other words, it's going to stay louder for longer before falling away more sharply, before the second pad rises in a slightly more linear way. Now, if I was to do the same thing in reverse and select a curve value of -10, we get the opposite behaviour. So effectively, the second pad is now going to get louder sort of during the sort of outro, if you like, of the first pad, the purple audio region here, before that one falls away in a slightly more linear fashion. So again, in terms of managing the relationship as one audio file becomes another, then we've got a chance to add curves. And that is particularly clear if we then look at the third type of fade, which is this idea of an S-curved crossfade, or XS for short. Now, when I select this option, we can see very clearly that what's happening is that we've got an S shape happening in both audio files. In other words, the volume map of this second pad is that it's going to kick up in volume, it's going to level out into something more linear at the crossfade point, and then it's going to shoot up in volume more quickly. And similarly, as a mirror image, the opposite behavior is going to happen with pad 1. Now, what you'll find is the way that Logic works is that if you select crossfades between audio files, with the very last audio file, by default, Logic will assume that you want the same amount of crossfade time, but because it can't apply a crossfade because it's the very last audio region, it will sort of put a fade out at the end of that file instead. Now, this gives us an opportunity to see another way in which we can apply fades. Rather than simply clicking on an audio file and then selecting its fade value here, what I can do is to come to the toolbar and select the fade tool, which is here. And this allows me to literally just draw a fade over the length of audio that I want. So if I want the whole of this audio file to fade out, I can create a much longer file, and I can see that the fade out value here is assigned. What I can also do with the fade tool is to change the angle of the fade. So if I wanted to fade out on the end, and again, a bit like a sort of curve, if you like, well, in fact, exactly like a curve, I've got an opportunity to decide whether or not I want the volume to fall away quite quickly to start with before leveling out, or alternatively to stay louder for longer and then to fall away more extremely at the end. Now, you might be thinking, well, what is the right value? What should I choose? What's the answer to that question? What sounds best? So experiment, try things out and see what sounds best within the context of your track. So in the toolbar, remember that's the fade tool, and we've also looked at the way that we can use crossfades between these individual files. So let's come back and put this into context a little bit more and just hear how this sounds with some crossfades. I'm going to go back, in fact, to an equal power crossfade. I'm going to select all of these regions and swap out the XS curve for an equal power crossfade instead, and we'll have a listen to how this sounds. Okay, so the length of my crossfades is bringing in pad 2 early. It sounds a bit weird. So what I'm going to do is to select all of these is to make sure that my crossfades, firstly, are much shorter. Let's take them down to, I don't know, 50 milliseconds. But the other thing is I'm not sure my curve was helping me. Sure enough, if we have a look at the values between these curves, if I come and find just one of these, I can see that pad 2 is sort of effectively starting early because of the curve value that I've selected. So I'm going to take those back to 0. Let's see if that sounds a little bit smoother on those edit points. Okay, so that deals with crossfades really nicely. So when might a fade in and a fade out be useful rather than using crossfades? Okay, well, let's suppose that what I want to do is to create a rhythm in pad 1. Now that this is audio, rather than simply having to kind of trigger this sound over MIDI, I can make this much more rhythmic if I want to. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to grab my scissors tool again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop at various points within this little region. I'm using the markers up here at the top to decide where to chop. I'm making sure that I'm always chopping on a 16th note somewhere or an 8th note. I'm leaving a kind of gap of either 1 or 2 of these regions between, or these individual markers between each individual chop. And you can see that I've now done that. I'm going to just solo round bar 1 for a moment. Having created those chops, what I'm going to do is to get rid of this crossfade for a second. Let's just get rid of that altogether by selecting it and then selecting 0. And then what I'm going to do is to select all of these regions, and I'm going to just decrease their length. Now, because the regions are of different lengths, that's going to give me different slices of audio length as well. But now when I press play, we're going to hear that this pad has got a kind of rhythm attached to it as a result of the fact that there's silence between the individual regions. But we've also got a lot of clicking because every single time I have chopped up a region, obviously the end of that little bit of waveform, if you like, where the pad is at that moment, is that it's not a 0 point, which means that it's just going to click because it just hasn't faded away to 0. So what I can do is to kind of fake the idea that it has faded away to 0 by using fades. So what I'm going to do is to put an unbelievably short fade in, 2 milliseconds on each file, and I'm going to put a 2 millisecond fade out on the end of each file and make sure that the out is the type of fade that I want to use. Now, 2 milliseconds is so short that we're not going to hear this as a fade in, like a nice, smooth, long attack time. It's still going to sound very percussive, but what it should have done is to get rid of the little clicks. Okay, so they're not long enough, these fades. In fact, actually, it's not that problem. If I look at these, I need to be careful here. I can see that whilst there is a fade in on the very first file, these other ones don't have a fade in. So I think my issue here is that if I select 2 milliseconds fade in for all of these files, with any luck, we'll now get rid of those clicks. Sure enough, so it's not clicking anymore, but we've still got that nice super short attack time that we might want. So I could go through all of the other files and I could create a rhythm out of that. And of course, effectively what I could do would be to create a rhythm maybe for the kind of purple regions and a different one for the second pad, and that would be a really nice way of creating something rhythmic out of this file. One last thing, let's have a look at the idea of a fade at the end of the track. How might we want to apply fade out to the end of our track. Well, I can't just do that to one of the pads because that isn't going to fade out the drums and it's not going to fade out the bass. So if what I wanted to do was to actually have my track fade out over a period of time, I clearly can't use the audio fades that we've looked at on the pad parts. Instead, what I need to do is to use volume automation to fade out my track. Well, okay, that obviously means that I'm going to need to create a fade out for the stereo output. That's where all of the sounds of my mix are being sent. So if I can automate the level of the volume fader in the output channel, then I'll be able to create the output fade out that I want. Now, there are a couple of ways I could do this. I could go into automation mode. I could select latch mode, for instance, and then literally just draw a drop in volume. And you can see the moment that I select latch mode, what's happened is that Logic has created a track for the stereo output so that I can actually just create the line that I want. And having created that track, rather than use automation and actually draw that myself, what I could do would be to open up the automation lane by pressing A, selecting volume, and then simply just drawing the point at which I want the fade out to start and the point at which I want it to end. And having dropped the value down to -infinity dB, in other words, silence, the track will now fade out. Okay, and of course, because I also, within the toolbar, just like I've got the fade tool, I also have the automation curve tool. If I want a non-linear fade out, if I want the volume to drop in a way, a bit like the other fades that we looked at, which either biases the volume towards the beginning of that fade or the end of it, I can simply just drag up and down to create the shape that I want. And if I drag left and right, what I have a chance to do is to create the kind of S shapes that we were looking at with the cross fade options up there as well, to create the type of shape that I want in order to manage the sort of volume drop away in level towards the end. So if what you want to do is to create a fade out for your track that applies to the whole mix, you can automate the stereo output by creating a volume ramp of your choice. And you can either do that simply by opening up one of the latch modes like touch or latch, which will introduce the stereo output, or alternatively, you can come to the track header here, or the track menu option, and what you can do is to select show output track. Mine is already in the track, so my option is to hide it. So if I select hide, it's going to disappear. But if I come to track and I show the output track, what that's going to do is to give me the output track as an active track within my project so that I can apply a fade out. So there's a lot of information all to do with fades.